In October 1983, what began as a normal afternoon at a rural Texas ranch turned into a blood-soaked crime scene. 4 men, Bob Tate, Jerry Brown, Philip Good and Ronald Mayes, were found shot execution-style inside an airplane hangar. They were husbands, fathers, and respected members of their community. The brutality stunned Grayson County, who could wipe out 4 men in cold blood. Investigators quickly zeroed in on an unlikely suspect, Lester Leroy Bower Jr., a 36-year-old chemical salesman family man with no criminal record. Prosecutors said Bower killed to steal an ultralight airplane and executed the others simply because they showed up at the wrong time. But as the years dragged on, doubts began to swirl. Was this really about a plane? Or was the truth buried in whispers of drug deals and hidden evidence? What followed was a legal battle stretching over 3 decades, making Bower one of Texas's longest-serving death row inmates. And in 2015, at the age of 67, he became the oldest person executed in the state since capital punishment resumed. But the most haunting details? His final words, and the questions that still linger about whether Texas put an innocent man to death. To understand how a family man became one of Texas's most controversial condemned killers, we have to go back to where it all began. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because these are the cases that stay with you long after the final word is spoken. Lester Leroy Bower Jr. was born on November 20, 1947, in Arlington, Texas, a growing suburban city just west of Dallas, Fort Worth. Unlike many names we come across in true crime stories, his didn't begin with hardship or violence. He wasn't a man born into chaos, nor raised in the shadow of abuse or crime. In fact, his early life was the opposite: stable, ordinary, and, at least on the surface, remarkably unremarkable. Growing up in a middle-class household, Bower lived what many would have called the American dream of the post-war years. Friends and neighbors remembered him as polite, dependable, and the kind of person you could trust to watch your house while you were out of town. Nothing in his childhood foreshadowed the darkness that would one day hover over his name. He attended school, excelled in his studies, and eventually went on to earn a college education, something not everyone from his generation and background achieved at the time. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bower had carved out a career as a chemical salesman, a job that gave him financial stability, a sense of purpose and respect within his community. He wasn't wealthy, but he was successful in a way that mattered most. He could support his family and provide them with a comfortable life. Coworkers described him as smart, diligent, and good with people. Clients trusted him. Supervisors respected him. His record was clean, his reputation solid. At home he was a family man. Married to his wife, Sherry, the two were raising 2 daughters together. Those who knew them best said they appeared to be the perfect couple. Hardworking parents with a strong marriage, active in their church and social circles, raising their girls with love and discipline. There were no red flags, no reports of domestic strife, no hidden troubles that might suggest a man capable of brutality. And perhaps the most striking detail of all, Lester Bower had no criminal history. Not even a hint of trouble with the law. No arrests, no violent episodes, no brushes with crime that could serve as a warning. To law enforcement, he would have been considered one of the least likely suspects in any investigation. Yet life has a way of turning unexpectedly, and in Bower's case, the ordinariness of his existence made the allegations against him all the more shocking. Because when the story of the 1983 Grayson County hangar murders began to unfold, people struggled to reconcile the image of the man they thought they knew. October 8, 1983 began as an ordinary Saturday in Grayson County, Texas, but by evening, it had turned into one of the darkest days the small community had ever seen. The ranch lands, usually filled with the hum of tractors and the distant call of livestock, would soon echo with the footsteps of investigators stepping into a scene of horror. Inside the airplane hangar on Bob Tate's ranch, deputies stumbled onto a nightmare. 4 men executed with single gunshots to the head, their bodies sprawled around the very aircraft they had come to see. The first of the victims was Bob Tate himself, the ranch owner. For years, Tate had been known as a man of generosity, someone who opened his hangar doors to friends and fellow aviation enthusiasts. But now, the same hangar that had been a place of camaraderie was the site of his violent death. Tate's body lay near the ultralight aircraft he had been preparing to sell. His dreams of sharing flight cut short in the most brutal way possible. Close by was Ronald Mayes, a former police officer. Mayes had once dedicated his life to protecting others, but on this day he was powerless to defend himself. Investigators found him slumped in the hangar, the precision of the shot that killed him underscoring the cold, calculated nature of the attack. For those who knew him, the sight of a man who once wore the badge lying lifeless was almost unbearable. A few steps away was Philip Good, an active Grayson County Sheriff's deputy, one of their own. Good hadn't been on duty that afternoon. He was there as a friend, simply enjoying time with men he trusted. Yet, when the first deputies arrived, they were met with the devastating reality of seeing one of their brothers in law enforcement lying in a pool of blood. It wasn't just shocking, it was personal. The fourth victim was Jerry Brown, a close friend of Tate's, who had come by the hangar that day with no idea of the danger that awaited him. Brown wasn't involved in law enforcement, nor was he tied to aviation in any professional way. He was simply there because of friendship. His presence became a cruel twist of fate, caught in a storm he never saw coming. The crime scene itself spoke volumes. The bodies were positioned in ways that suggested no struggle, no warning. Execution-style killings, clean, precise, deliberate. Each shot fired at close range, leaving no chance for survival. On the floor were scattered airplane parts, blood stains darkening the dust, and the overwhelming silence of lives cut short. The investigation into the brutal quadruple homicide at Bob Tate's ranch in October 1983 quickly became one of the most complex and controversial cases in Texas history, and at the heart of it all was a trail of evidence that, according to law enforcement, pointed directly toward a man no one ever expected, Lester Leroy Bower Jr., the quiet, law-abiding chemical salesman from Arlington. At first, detectives were baffled. There were no eyewitnesses, no immediate signs of forced entry, and no clear motive for the cold, execution-style killings of four respected men. The crime scene itself was both eerie and overwhelming, the hangar littered with the remains of an ultralight aircraft, blood pooling beneath the victims and bullet casings scattered across the floor. But as investigators meticulously combed through the evidence, one detail began to stand out: the airplane parts. Several unique components were missing, and police soon discovered that only a handful of individuals had been negotiating the purchase of such ultralight planes. Among them was none other than Lester Bower. When officers first approached Bower, he was cooperative, even polite, projecting the calm demeanor of a man who had nothing to hide. He admitted he had been in contact with Bob Tate about buying an ultralight plane, but he insisted he had never visited the ranch and had certainly never met the other men killed that night. Investigators, however, weren't convinced, and as they pressed harder, they uncovered more troubling details. A search of Bower's home yielded parts from an ultralight aircraft that matched the missing pieces from the crime scene. To police, this was the first crack in the mask of an otherwise ordinary man. Another piece of evidence quickly became central to the case: the .22 caliber ammunition. Investigators recovered Fiocchi brand .22 caliber shells from the scene, uncommon ammunition at the time. When officers learned that Bower not only owned a .22 caliber pistol but had purchased Fiocchi rounds from a local gun store, it seemed like more than a coincidence. The prosecution would later argue that this rare ammunition was a smoking gun, linking him directly to the murders. Yet, years later, this very claim about the rarity of the ammunition would be one of the most hotly disputed points of the case. As detectives circled around him, Bower's story began to shift. Initially he was firm. He had never set foot on Tate's ranch. But confronted with mounting evidence, he later changed his account, admitting that he had indeed visited the property on the day of the murders. According to his revised statement, he arrived to finalize the purchase of the ultralight, dismantled the aircraft himself, and then drove away, leaving Tate and the other men very much alive. To investigators, however, this sudden change sounded less like a clarification and more like the desperate adjustment of a man caught in a lie. By the spring of 1984, the suspicion had solidified into an arrest. Bower, the mild-mannered family man with no criminal history, was charged with 4 counts of capital murder. His image shifted overnight, from husband, father, and successful salesman to an accused mass murderer facing the death penalty. The narrative that prosecutors would build was chilling. Here was a man who killed 4 people in cold blood simply to obtain an ultralight plane. It was a motive that seemed shockingly small compared to the magnitude of the crime, yet the circumstantial evidence, plane parts in his home, the ammunition match, and his shifting story, painted a damning picture. Still, from the very beginning, there was an undercurrent of doubt. Was this truly the full story? Or was Lester Bower an easy target, a man whose ties to the ultralight made him a convenient suspect in a crime that might have been far more complicated than it seemed? By April 1984, the farming communities of North Texas were bracing themselves for what would become one of the most closely watched murder trials in Grayson County history. The courthouse in Sherman, Texas, was packed each day as people came to witness the case against Lester Leroy Bower Jr., a man who until only months earlier had been known simply as a mild-mannered chemical salesman, a devoted husband, and the father of 2 young daughters. Now he stood accused of 4 brutal execution-style murders. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their theory of the crime. They told jurors that Bower, driven by greed and a desire to own an ultralight aircraft, had arranged a meeting with Bob Tate at his ranch. According to the state, what began as a transaction quickly turned deadly. Prosecutors argued that Bower killed Tate in order to steal the plane, and when 3 other men, Ronald Mayes, a former police officer, Philip Good, a Grayson County sheriff's deputy, and Jerry Brown, Tate's close friend, witnessed the crime, Bower executed them one by one to cover his tracks. It was, the state said, a cold-blooded chain of murders committed not out of rage or passion, but out of cold calculation. Central to their case was the physical evidence. Jurors were shown ultralight plane parts recovered from Bower's own garage, parts that investigators said matched perfectly with those missing from Tate's hangar. They heard testimony about the Fiocchi .22 caliber ammunition, a detail prosecutors emphasized as a rare and unusual brand of bullets, the same kind found at the crime scene and later linked to purchases Bower had made. And then there was Bower's own shifting timeline, first denying he had ever gone to Tate's ranch, then later admitting he had visited, dismantled the plane and left the men alive. To prosecutors, this change of story was not the sign of an innocent man clarifying his memory but rather the calculated adjustment of a guilty man caught in his lies. Throughout the trial, Bower's defense team fought hard to counter the narrative. They argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that the so-called rare ammunition was in fact more widely available than the state suggested, and that Bower had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. They tried to remind jurors that this was a man with no criminal history, a man with a family, a man with everything to lose and nothing to gain by slaughtering 4 people in cold blood over an airplane. But despite their efforts, the weight of the prosecution's theory bore heavily on the jury. After weeks of testimony and only hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts of capital murder. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of relief and grim satisfaction, a feeling that justice had finally been served for the 4 lives so brutally taken. But for Bower and his loved ones, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The sentence was swift and severe: death by lethal injection. In that moment, Lester Bower's life changed forever. Once a respected member of his community, he was now condemned to die by the state of Texas. As the gavel fell, sealing his fate, the divide in public opinion began to grow. Some believed justice had been rightfully served, while others questioned whether the circumstantial case was truly strong enough to justify the ultimate punishment. And so, as the courtroom emptied and the doors of the prison closed behind him, Lester Bower's long journey through the appeals process began. A journey that would stretch on for more than 3 decades, making his case one of the longest death row ordeals in Texas history. For most men on Texas death row, the appeals process lasts a few years, sometimes a decade, before the state carries out its sentence. But in the case of Lester Leroy Bower Jr., the legal battles, the questions of guilt, and the haunting doubts stretched on for more than 31 years, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in the history of Texas capital punishment. And through it all, Bower maintained the same unshakable position: I did not kill those men. From the very beginning, his defense team argued that his conviction rested on shaky ground: circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies, and what they claimed were serious misrepresentations by the prosecution. One of the most glaring issues centered around the Fiocchi .22 caliber ammunition. At trial in 1984, jurors had been told that these particular bullets were rare, exotic, and virtually unique, an almost perfect match linking Bower directly to the crime scene. Prosecutors insisted that this was damning proof. But years later, defense attorneys uncovered evidence that the brand was, in fact, far more widely available in Texas than the state had claimed. To critics, this wasn't just a minor detail, it was potentially the collapse of one of the prosecution's strongest pillars. But ammunition wasn't the only issue. Bower's lawyers argued that key evidence had been withheld, information that could have pointed jurors toward entirely different suspects. Among the most explosive revelations was a testimony that surfaced in 1989, years after the trial. A woman came forward to say that her boyfriend and 3 of his friends had privately confessed to her that they were the real killers. According to her account, the hangar murders weren't about an ultralight airplane at all. Instead, she said, they stemmed from a drug deal gone wrong, a botched exchange of money, drugs, and betrayal that had spiraled into a massacre. Her statement painted an entirely different picture of the crime, one that placed Bower not as the calculating mastermind but as a man tragically caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps not even present at all. Yet despite the potential weight of this testimony, the courts dismissed it, arguing that it came too late and lacked sufficient corroboration. To Bower's supporters, however, it was another chilling example of a justice system unwilling to revisit its own mistakes. Over the years, criminologists, legal scholars and advocacy groups began to weigh in. They argued that the Bower case was emblematic of how circumstantial evidence can sometimes railroad defendants into death row convictions. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon definitively tied to him, and yet he had been sentenced to die. Some saw it as a cautionary tale, warning that once the machinery of justice starts moving, it becomes nearly impossible to stop, even in the face of serious doubt. For the families of the victims, these endless appeals and alternative theories were painful, reopening old wounds again and again. To them, the courts had spoken and justice had been served decades ago. But for Bower's family, and for those who believed in his innocence, each new revelation felt like confirmation that the wrong man was paying the ultimate price. Through all of it, Bower himself remained steadfast. Interviewed from behind prison walls, he said again and again that he had dismantled the plane that day but left while all 4 men were still alive. He admitted his mistake in lying early on, when he told investigators he had never gone to the hangar, a lie he later said came from panic and fear of being implicated, but he never once admitted to the murders. As the years rolled into decades, his case became one of the most controversial death penalty stories in Texas, a lightning rod for debates about fairness, reliability, and the possibility of executing an innocent man. By the time his final execution date was set in 2015, the question that hung in the air was no longer just, did Lester Bower kill those men? But also, can we ever be absolutely certain that he did? By the time the calendar turned to 2015, Lester Leroy Bower Jr. had become something of an anomaly within the Texas prison system. Where most men on death row survive only a handful of years before their sentences are carried out, Bower had managed to remain alive for more than 3 decades, his execution delayed again and again by a maze of appeals, petitions and last-minute stays. He was no longer just another condemned man, he was one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Texas history, a prisoner whose fate seemed forever suspended between life and death. Through the years, his attorneys had filed appeals in both state and federal courts, pressing every possible angle, questions about the ammunition evidence, withheld testimony that could have pointed to other suspects, and the growing chorus of doubts voiced by criminologists and legal scholars. At one point, the case even made its way before the U.S. Supreme Court, but each time, the justices declined to intervene. Every denial tightened the noose around Bower's future, until eventually the last legal doors had been closed for good. In June of 2015, the state of Texas scheduled his execution, this time with a grim finality. Bower was transferred to the Huntsville unit, the prison known for housing Texas's death chamber. The days leading up to an execution at Huntsville follow a strict and almost ritualistic routine. Inmates are placed under constant watch, their movements limited, their contact with the outside world reduced to visits from attorneys, clergy, and immediate family members. Guards, chaplains, and wardens follow procedures that have been carried out hundreds of times before, their voices steady, their actions precise, as though routine could somehow make what was coming less human and less final. For Bower, the final days were marked by reflection and preparation. He had lived in the shadow of death for more than 31 years, and now the moment he had fought against for decades was drawing closer with every hour. Outside the prison walls, the case continued to stir controversy and media attention, with supporters insisting he had been wrongfully convicted and prosecutors maintaining the jury had been right all along. Inside, however, everything narrowed to the small, sterile confines of a death row cell and the ticking clock that marked his last days on earth. For generations, Texas had been known for its last meal tradition, where condemned inmates could request a final dish of their choice before execution. But by 2011, that tradition had ended after one high-profile inmate abused the privilege. By the time Lester Bower faced his execution in 2015, the custom was gone. Instead of choosing a special plate of comfort food, he was given the standard prison meal of the day, a stark reminder of how the state had stripped even the smallest gestures of mercy from the process. Yet it wasn't the food that defined his final moments, but the words he chose to leave behind. On the evening of June 3, 2015, strapped to the gurney inside Huntsville's death chamber, Bower looked out through the glass toward the witnesses, his family, his friends, and those who had stood by him through 31 years of confinement. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with the quiet faith that had sustained him through decades of uncertainty. He began by expressing gratitude, I would like to thank all of my family and friends for sticking with me through all these years." He then spoke words that carried the weight of his journey, invoking scripture. "I have fought the good fight." And finally, instead of a goodbye, he offered something softer, something hopeful. "I am not going to say goodbye, I will simply say until we meet again. I love you very, very much." At 6:36 p.m., the drugs flowed, his breathing slowed, and Lester Leroy Bower Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 67 years old, having spent nearly half his life on death row. For some, his death marked the long-overdue closing of a chapter that had haunted Grayson County since 1983. For others, it left behind a gnawing question that will never truly be answered. Did Texas execute a guilty man, or did the state end the life of someone who had been innocent all along? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with friends, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another deep dive into the most gripping true crime cases from across America. But most importantly, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Was the evidence strong enough to justify the ultimate punishment, or does this stand as one of the greatest injustices in Texas history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start the conversation.